Alright, this is what you've all been waiting for. We're starting our next unit. So the learning target, which you're going to fill in here on your notes page in just a second, is I can solve problems involving the division of fractions. Now today's vocabulary, you're not even going to need to know this vocabulary for today's lesson, but you should know it from before, and we'll talk about it later, so it's just common knowledge. Numerator, that's the top number in a fraction showing the parts that you have. Denominator is the bottom number in a fraction that shows the number of parts in a whole. And a reciprocal, which you may not know, is a fraction after it's been flipped over. Okay, so let's scroll down here and take a look at 3/5. Look at the different parts. The 3 is the numerator. The 5 is the denominator. And numerator is not spelled with an E, it's spelled with an O. Okay. And 3/5, so an example of that would be if you had a cake with 5 pieces. 5 would be the whole, all 5, and you have 3 of them, or you've eaten 3 of them. 3/5 of the cake would be shaded in, so that's what 3/5 means. Now the reciprocal of 3/5, which this word's going to become really important when we actually do learn how to divide fractions. The reciprocal of 3/5 is 5/3. Okay, it's the flipped over fraction. Okay, so now pause the video and fill in your what examples in your first section of notes. Now we're ready for the why section. Why do we divide? Well, we divide to either find out how big each group is when we split up a number, or we divide to find out how many groups we can make of a certain size. So the example would be, if $24 is shared among 3 people, how much money will each person get? $24 is shared among 3 people. How much will each person get? 8. So this is an example of number 1. Each group would be $8 because we're splitting it into 3 groups. Or we're splitting it into groups of 3. Okay, another example of why we divide is to find out how many groups we can make out of a certain size. Okay, so let's look at the second example. If it costs $6 to go to a movie, how many times can you go to the movies if you have $24? So how many groups of $6 can you make? That's what this question's asking. So it's a division question. You're starting with the $24. You know it costs $6 each time, so you're going to make groups of $6, and when you do, you end up with 4 groups of $6, so you could go to the movie 4 times. So that's why we divide. You should divide when you want to make equal groups. Okay? If you're sharing cookies with somebody, or some people, like the whole classroom, you would divide. If you're splitting up money that you earned, if you were working together and you needed to split it up evenly. If you were sharing equal amounts of a job, so if you were working with your sister to mow the lawn, then you would divide the lawn. Or if there were 5 of you, it'd divide by 5. Those are examples of when you might divide. Now fill in your y examples on your notes page. Don't forget to pause the video. And the last section of your notes is on the how. We're going to learn how to understand division problems. So you're going to be answering some problems today, but mostly we're not dividing fractions today. We are understanding the parts of a division problem. And just understanding the parts can help you solve some problems. So here's the steps, only 2 steps. Find the amount that represents the total, or what you start with. That's the first number in the division problem. Step 2 is find the number of groups you need to split the first amount into and the size of each group. One of these numbers is the second number in the division problem. It's what you are dividing by. And the other is the answer. It's the number after the equal sign. Those could be flipped around. The first number, the total, is always what you're going to start with. But the second number and the answer can be flipped around. What I mean is, when you have 6 divided by 2 equaling 3, you can also have 6 divided by 3 equaling 2. These numbers, which is what I'm talking about here, can be flipped around. These numbers can be flipped around, but the number that you start with can't be flipped around, otherwise you change the problem. Okay? So, let's look at this example. Luke walks 1/4 of a mile to his friend's home. How many trips will he make if he walks 2 1/4 miles? So what we want to do is write this into a division problem. Okay, let's find the amount or total that you start with. He walks 1/4 mile to his friend's home. How many trips will he make if he walks 2 1/4 miles? This looks like the total, 2 1/4. So if we take 2 1/4, we're going to divide by the other number in the problem. We're going to divide by 1/4. We're going to see how many 1/4s you could have if 2 1/4 is your total. Okay? So here's a drawing of 2 1/4. There's 1, there's 2, and here's 1/4. Now I took the whole miles and split them up into 4 sections since we were talking about fourths. So we've got 4 sections in the first mile, 4 sections in the second, and a fourth to make 2 1/4. We're going to divide by 1/4, so how many 1/4s are there? Well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The answer is 9. So how many trips will he make if he walks 2 1/4 miles? He'll make 9 trips. Let's look at another problem. If you have 8 1/2 cups of shelled peas, you can get 11 1/3 servings if each serving is 3/4 of a cup. So in this case, we know all 3 numbers. We just have to place them in the problem correctly. So what number do you start with? Okay, you have 8 1/2 cups. Sounds like you're starting with 8 1/2. You can get 11 1/3. Sounds like it's going to equal 11 1/3. That sounds like an answer. And each serving is 3/4 of a cup. So if you take your 8 1/2 cups and you divide it into 3/4 cup groups, you would get this many groups. That's the equation that would go with that situation. You start with 8 1/2 cups, you split it into 3/4 cups, and you end up with 11 1/3 groups. Now this is kind of interesting that you would start with 8 1/2 and you would end up with more than you start with, but that's because you're not even dividing by 1. You're dividing by 3/4. You're saying how many 3/4 does it take to make 8 1/2? And when you divide by 1 whole, a number stays the same. When you divide by something bigger than 1, a number gets smaller. But when you divide by a number less than 1, like this one, like 3/4, you end up getting a number that is bigger than what you started with. And that's some of the understanding that we're going to be working towards in this unit. So now, fill in your how examples and show me your notes and get started on your 10 marks assignment.